Whistleblowers are always accused of helping America's enemies. That says my guest today, Glenn Greenwald. He's the reporter who brought to light Edward Snowden's leaks about mass U.S. government surveillance a couple of years back. Now, Greenwald and Snowden, of course, are no strangers to the wrath of high government officials. Yet Greenwald says that even he's surprised at how quick U.S. officials have been, as he sees it, to exploit the Paris attacks to brand Snowden as an enabler of terrorists. Now, Greenwald rejects such charges as unbelievably irrational. He says they're little more than the government's spy masters deflecting blame for failing miserably in their own jobs. Glenn Greenwald, you join us today from Rio de Janeiro. Thanks for being here on the show.
Thanks for having me.
I want to just see if I get this right in outlining the arguments of the critics. They're basically saying that Edward Snowden, by providing his leaks, essentially provided jihadists with the information on how they were being tracked, leading them to encrypt their messages, making it harder for the government to track them down, thus enabling these attacks. An argument that you say is utter hogwash.
It's a blatant lie for so many reasons. As even the New York Times editorial page, which is usually quite restrained, pointed out yesterday in saying that it was disgraceful the way the CIA is trying to exploit the attack in Paris to demonize Edward Snowden and specifically encryption. To begin with, nobody has any idea whether the attackers in Paris used the internet at all, let alone used encryption. So they're just making this up. In fact, there's good reason to believe, given that they were siblings from the same neighborhoods, that they did most of their planning face-to-face, not using encryption at all. Secondly, it's been true for 20 years that terrorists use sophisticated encryption way before Edward Snowden ever came on the scene. You can find articles 15 years ago where the government warns that Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden are using sophisticated encryption because everybody already knew before Edward Snowden that these governments are trying to spy on the terrorists. We didn't tell the terrorists anything they didn't already know. What we told the world is that they're not just spying on the terrorists, but ordinary citizens by the hundreds of millions all over the globe. What this is government agencies who get tens of billions of dollars a year, huge amounts of spying powers, who have one job, and that is to find people plotting terrorist attacks. And in this case, they failed miserably. 129 people died in Paris as a result, and so they're desperately looking for other people to blame for their own failures, and blaming Edward Snowden is a really easy thing to do.
And Glenn, what's interesting here is there have been obviously more limits on what intelligence agencies, specifically U.S. agencies, can do. There's greater oversight these days, but even with that, you're making the argument that they still have formidable powers to survey and to spy.
Well, let's look at what those limits are that they're claiming they now suffer under as a result of the Snowden documents. The limits, by the way, that were imposed democratically by the U.S. Congress. First of all, those limits pertain only to the NSA's ability to spy domestically on American citizens on American soil. They have had no limits placed on them since the Snowden reporting on how they can spy internationally, meaning people in France, meaning people in Belgium, meaning people in Syria and Iraq. They have exactly the same powers that they had pre-Snowden now to spy and to have found the people plotting these attacks. Secondly, the law that was passed by Congress that limited what the NSA could do in the wake of the Snowden revelations, that law, it hasn't taken effect yet. Their powers are exactly the same as they were in 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011. They have no explanation for why they failed to find these attackers other than their own ineptitude and their own incompetence. And that is the issue, is that when you're an agency like the NSA, that engages in mass surveillance. You collect billions and billions of calls and emails every single day, not just about terrorists, but innocent people all over the world. It becomes harder, not easier, to find the people who are plotting to do something like this, or who are going to attack the Boston Marathon or the offices of Charlie Hebdo. That is the problem, is their spying is so out of control that they don't even realize what it is they're collecting.
So Glenn, in your view, one of the first out of the gates with the criticism was last Monday, John Brennan, the current director of the CIA, who basically, he lashed out at all this hand-wringing over the government's role in efforts to uncover terrorists. What is he seeking? What does he want? You're saying that they have massive powers as it is. What is he looking for?
Well, for a long time, as I indicated, people on the internet have been using encryption, mathematical and technological means of building a wall around their communication so the government can't monitor it. Just like we go into our homes and have private conversations in the sanctity of our own homes that the government can't have access to. And the US government has been obsessed with the idea for 2 decades that any encryption that exists should have to have a backdoor built into it so the US government can enter that backdoor and read people's communications whenever they decide that they should. And the problem that Silicon Valley has been pointing out over and over, leading companies like Apple and Google and Facebook, the leading engineers and experts at these companies, what they've been saying is, we cannot build a backdoor for you into encryption because if we do, it isn't just you, the US government, but the Russian government and the Chinese government and the Iranian government and stateless organizations like hackers and terrorists will also be able to use that backdoor. And so there is no way to give the US government what it wants, which is full and total access to everybody's communications. And now they're trying to use and exploit the horrible Paris attack to get what it is that they've wanted for 20 years by telling people, look, if you don't give us the backdoor into encryption, more attacks like this are going to happen, even though they have no idea whether the attackers used encryption in this case. That's what this fight is really about, is about putting pressure on Silicon Valley companies not to provide privacy to their users.
And what about, though, the reports, and there have been many reports, that there are, if not in these particular attacks, jihadist networks in general starting to use more encrypted applications, applications such as Wicker or Telegram, to send encrypted mobile messages over their cell phones. What can you do to stop that?
Well, first of all, there may be nothing that you can do. For instance, as we discussed earlier, it's very likely that a lot of the planning that was done for this Paris attack was done not over the internet or by cell phones, but was done face-to-face, because they were siblings, they were longtime friends, they were cousins. The same was true of Charlie Hebdo, where the perpetrators were siblings, and also the attack on the Boston Marathon done by 2 brothers. And so a lot of the plotting and a lot of the planning gets done by people meeting face-to-face in their homes. So are we now going to say that the government has to have access to every single kind of communication that ever takes place on the planet, and so we should now put monitors in the rooms of every home in the planet that the government can turn on whenever they want or whenever the court says they can to listen to conversations? It isn't the case in a free society that you can have absolute safety. And as long as people are out there creating technological ways to produce encryption, which they're going to do, we have to accept the fact that there is going to continue to be privacy among human beings on the earth, meaning that they're going to be able to communicate without the government listening. That's a really good thing. And I think it's important to note that if you're a citizen of France or the US or Great Britain or any other Western country, the chances that you're going to die in a terrorist attack are still lower than the chances that you're going to die by getting struck by lightning or falling in the bathtub and hitting your head. And I think it's important to keep that perspective in mind.
Right, Glenn Greenwald. What would you say, though, to members of the average Americans, perhaps, or even French or Brits, listening to these arguments and basically putting their hands up and saying, you know what, at the end of the day, we're scared. Whatever it takes to put down these terrorists, we will give the government whatever surveillance powers it says it needs if it helps us remain safe?
I would hope that people around the world, in France and the United States in particular, have learned the lesson from first the 9/11 attack and then the Iraq War, which is that people in political power will always try and maximize the fear levels that their populations are experiencing, because a fearful population is a submissive population. And political scientists and philosophers have pointed this out for centuries, that fear is a weapon that governments use. And when the government puts us in fear, when we allow that to happen, we do really irrational things. We allow the government to do really destructive things, like invade Iraq, like create Gitmo in the middle of an ocean, like torture people around the world, like use drones to kill civilians that fuel ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations. And I think it's our responsibility as citizens not to allow the government to manipulate and stoke our fears in order to prevent us from thinking clearly and rationally about what we want them to do.
Finally, I just want to ask, in the little time we have left, the hacktivist group, the hacker group Anonymous, has launched declared their own war of sorts on the Islamic State group. It's a digital war. They want to shut down their networks. What is your immediate reaction to that announcement?
I think it's well-intentioned. The problem is that it doesn't do very much good. I mean, it's not like ISIS will disappear if you shut down some of their Twitter accounts. And there's actually some potential harms, like depriving intelligence agencies of resources, which are people talking openly on Twitter who have allegiance to ISIS. And also, I think if you take away people's outlet, sometimes you can actually cause them to then engage in action. I think it's better to let people freely express their views on Twitter because sometimes that becomes a way that they don't feel a need to go out and kill people.
Glenn Greenwald, I thank you very much. You're the journalist that first brought to light the Edward Snowden's revelations about mass U.S. government surveillance, and you have been writing quite a bit this week, backlash against Edward Snowden and defending basically Edward Snowden against attacks that you say are completely irrational, attacks in which critics have been saying he's essentially been enabling the terrorists behind these Paris attacks. I thank you very much for joining us today from Rio de Janeiro, and I thank our viewers
Appreciate it.
as well for joining us. Stay tuned here for more news on France 24.